clock on the microwave read 2:47 a.m. when Daniel Mercer shuffled into the kitchen in his worn house slippers, the ones his late wife Margaret had given him the Christmas before the cancer took her. He hadn't been able to sleep again. The old house made its creaking sounds, the radiator knocked, and his mind, as it often did in the deep hours, wandered through rooms he could no longer lock. He was 71 years old. He'd buried a wife, raised a son, built a contracting business from nothing, and sold it for enough to live comfortably until the end of his days. He hadn't expected those days to feel so heavy. Daniel filled a glass of water, stood at the sink, and looked out at the dark backyard. The oak tree Margaret had planted when their son Ryan was born stood enormous now, its arms spread wide like it owned the night. He smiled faintly at that. He didn't go back to bed right away. Instead, he wandered into the small sitting room that had once been a study, his study, but which had slowly, over the 18 months since Ryan and his wife Cassandra moved in, transformed into something he didn't quite recognize. The heavy oak desk was gone, sold at Cassandra's suggestion. The bookshelves had been cleared to make way for her exercise equipment. The reading chair he'd owned for 30 years sat crammed into the corner, a throw pillow on it that read live, laugh, love in gold stitching. He didn't like that pillow. He sat in the chair anyway. That's when he noticed it, a slim spiral-bound notebook that had slipped between the chair cushion and the armrest, partially hidden. He recognized it as Cassandra's. She kept several of them around the house, always scribbling. Ryan called it journaling. Daniel had never paid it much mind. He almost set it on the side table without opening it. Almost. He told himself later that it was the pages. They'd fanned open when he picked it up, and a specific line had jumped up at him before he'd even made a conscious decision to read, like the words had reached out and grabbed him by the collar. If he signs before the spring, we're set for life. Daniel sat very still. He was a man who had spent 50 years reading contracts, blueprints, invoices, and legal documents. He knew how to parse language quickly, to identify the sentence that mattered, and that sentence mattered. He read on. The notebook was not a diary in the traditional sense. Cassandra didn't write about her feelings, her dreams, her day. She wrote in fragments, more like notes to herself, a planning document. He'd seen that style before, in the early days of his business when he used to jot ideas about clients in shorthand nobody else could read. He recognized the method because he had invented a version of it himself. Over the next 20 minutes, by the pale light of the side lamp, Daniel pieced together what his daughter-in-law had been carefully arranging over the past year and a half. The plan was not violent, it was not dramatic, it was in many ways more chilling for how ordinary it looked on paper. Cassandra, who had swooped into Ryan's life 3 years ago after a whirlwind romance, who had insisted almost immediately that Ryan's aging father needed family close by, who had championed the idea of moving into Daniel's house to take care of him, had been methodically positioning herself as his primary caregiver and closest confidant. She'd slowly pushed away his friends. His neighbor Bill had stopped coming around after Cassandra, made pointed comments about people taking advantage of generous older men. His daughter-in-law from his first marriage, a woman named Patricia who'd stayed close after her own husband passed, had been frozen out after a manufactured argument that Daniel still didn't fully understand. The notebook made the architecture of it plain. There were references to a lawyer, not the family attorney Daniel had used for decades, but a new one, someone named Gruber. There were notes about a power of attorney document. There were calculations, his house, estimated at market value, his savings account, the investment portfolio his financial advisor had built over 25 years. There were dates circled. Spring had been underlined twice. And there was one line that Daniel had to read 3 times before his brain would fully accept it. R doesn't need to know all of it, he just needs to stay agreeable. R was Ryan. His son. Daniel closed the notebook. He set it back exactly where he'd found it, wedged between the cushion and the armrest at the precise angle it had been before. Then he went upstairs, got into bed, and lay in the dark with his eyes open for a very long time. He did not sleep. But he did think, clearly, carefully, the way he used to think when a project had gone sideways, and panic was the enemy. Panic was always the enemy. What do I know for certain, he asked himself, and what do I do next? The first thing Daniel did was call Patricia. He drove to a gas station 2 miles from the house to make the call. He'd noticed, a few weeks back, that Cassandra had a habit of lingering near doorways when he was on the phone in the kitchen. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring, groggy. When he told her he needed to talk, really talk, her voice sharpened instantly. She'd always been sharp, Patricia. He'd never fully appreciated that until now. "Danny," she said quietly, "I've been waiting for this call." She knew something was wrong. She'd sensed it for months, but hadn't known how to reach him without Cassandra intercepting. She told him about a phone call she'd received from Bill, old neighbor Bill, who had been turned away from the house twice when he'd come to visit, told once that Daniel was sleeping, and once that he wasn't up for company. Daniel hadn't been told about either visit. "She's been building a wall around you," Patricia said, "and doing it slow enough that you'd think it was just life." Daniel thought of the sitting room, the reading chair in the corner, the pillow. "I need a lawyer," he said. "My own, someone she doesn't know about." "I know someone," Patricia said immediately. What happened over the following 6 weeks was the most deliberate period of Daniel's life, and he had once negotiated a $14 million commercial contract under a 2-day deadline. He met with an attorney, a woman named Helen Voss, referred by Patricia, sharp-eyed and unhurried, who reviewed his existing estate documents and walked him through his vulnerabilities. The current power of attorney, it turned out, had language that was broader than Daniel had realized when he'd signed it years earlier. Ryan was the named agent, which was appropriate, but Helen pointed out that depending on interpretation, a spouse could act in certain capacities. "Did you draft this yourself?" Helen asked. "My old lawyer did, about 8 years ago." "And who suggested you update it 18 months ago?" "She was looking at an amendment in the file." Daniel looked up. "Cassandra said I should modernize it." Helen folded her hands on the desk and said nothing. Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, even though he was sitting perfectly still. They revoked the amended document and drafted a new one, airtight, with Helen's firm named as a secondary oversight entity. They also established a revocable living trust that placed his assets under structured management. It wasn't impenetrable, but it was far more complex than whatever Cassandra had been planning to navigate. Then came the harder work. Daniel had to figure out what Ryan knew. This was the question that had kept him awake more nights than any other. The notebook had said Ryan didn't need to know all of it. But how much did Ryan know? Was his son complicit? Was he a participant in the plan, or was he himself being maneuvered? Daniel watched his son carefully over the following weeks. He watched without Cassandra knowing he was watching. He'd become surprisingly skilled at that, having lived with her for 18 months. What he saw broke his heart in a specific, complicated way. Ryan was not scheming. Ryan was distracted. Ryan was a man in his early 40s who worked long hours, who came home tired, who had been slowly, gently, persistently shaped by his wife into a man who deferred to her on household matters, on family decisions, on what his father needed and didn't need. He hadn't been recruited into a conspiracy. He'd been managed, handled. The same way Daniel had been managed, just differently, with different tools, because Ryan was younger and the levers were different. Daniel recognized it because he saw, for the first time, how it had worked on himself. The slow replacement of his preferences with hers, the incremental redefinition of what was good for Daniel, the quiet erasure of the people who might have offered a different perspective. Cassandra was, Daniel concluded, extraordinarily capable. In another context, applied towards something honest, it might have been admirable. He felt grief about Ryan, not anger, grief. His boy had been as much a target as he had, just aimed differently. Daniel chose a Tuesday evening in late February to begin the unraveling. He waited until Cassandra had gone to her book club. He had, he noted with dark amusement, never been invited to meet a single one of her book club friends in 18 months, and he sat down with Ryan in the kitchen. He made 2 cups of coffee the way he always had, with the old percolator Cassandra hated and had twice tried to donate to Goodwill. He set a folder on the table. He didn't lead with the notebook. He led with the documents, the original power of attorney amendment, annotated by Helen Voss. He led with the timeline Patricia had helped him reconstruct of the subtle isolations. He led with facts, the same way he'd always led in business. Ryan didn't speak for a long time after Daniel finished. "Then, Dad, I didn't." "I know," Daniel said. "I know you didn't." "The lawyer she mentioned, Gruber, she said it was just an estate planning update. She said you'd mentioned wanting to get it done." "I never mentioned that." Ryan sat with that. "She told me Bill stopped coming around because you'd had a falling out." "Bill was turned away from the door twice without my knowledge." Ryan's jaw tightened. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "She loves me," Ryan said, but it came out less like a declaration and more like a question he was addressing to himself. "I don't know what she feels," Daniel said carefully. "I know what I read, I know what I've documented. What you decide to do with your marriage is your business, and I will support you however I can, but I needed you to see the truth." Ryan looked at the folder. He looked at his father. "Where are you going to go?" he asked. And in that question, Daniel heard something raw, his son's fear that this meant losing him. "Nowhere far," Daniel said. "I've already spoken to a realtor. There's a small house 2 streets over from Patricia. Good light, a yard, room for that reading chair." Ryan's eyes went red at the edges. "I'm sorry, Dad." "Don't be," Daniel said. "Be clear-eyed, that's all I'm asking." Daniel moved out on a Saturday in March, 2 weeks before whatever spring deadline Cassandra had been circling in that notebook. He didn't make a scene. He packed the things that mattered: Margaret's photographs, the reading chair, the percolator, 3 boxes of books, and he loaded them into a rented van with help from Bill, who'd shown up without being asked because Patricia had called him, because that's what the people Cassandra had been trying to erase did when they were given the chance. Cassandra stood in the doorway when the van was almost full. She wore an expression Daniel had learned to read over the past 18 months, a careful blankness that covered rapid calculation. "Daniel," she said, "you don't have to do this." "I know," he said pleasantly. "That's rather the point." She searched his face for something: leverage, perhaps. A crack. She didn't find one. Ryan stood behind her, and when Daniel looked at his son, Ryan gave him a small nod. He didn't know yet what he would do about his marriage. That was a long road with no clear end. But he was awake now, and Daniel could see it in his eyes, the particular wakefulness of someone who has had a comfortable illusion removed and is deciding, with difficulty and courage, to live without it. Daniel shook Bill's hand. He hugged his son for a long time. Then he got in the van. The new house smelled like fresh paint and old wood. The yard was modest, but the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at an angle that reminded him, achingly and wonderfully, of the house where he and Margaret had raised Ryan all those years ago. He set the reading chair by the window first. Then he put the kettle on. Bill came in with a box of books and said something about helping with the shelves, and Daniel said he'd appreciate that. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later with a casserole and the kind of easy, undemanding company that he had forgotten, during 18 months of careful management, that he was allowed to want. That evening, after everyone had gone, and the boxes were only half unpacked, and the new house still felt unfamiliar around its edges, Daniel sat in the reading chair by the window with a cup of tea and watched the street go quiet under the streetlights. He thought about Margaret. He thought about Ryan. He thought about all the slow, subtle ways a person's world can be rearranged around them without their noticing, until one night at 2:47 a.m. they pick up a notebook they shouldn't have, and a single line of someone else's handwriting gives them back their eyes. He was 71 years old. He had good friends, a son he hadn't lost, a lawyer he trusted, a percolator that made the coffee exactly right, and a reading chair positioned perfectly in the light. He was, he realized, going to be fine. Better than fine. He was, for the first time in a long time, free. Sometimes the most dangerous plans are the quiet ones, and sometimes the most powerful act of self-preservation is simply paying attention.